Let's talk about the product. I want to just walk me through like how you went about building that. Now, we often talk about, hey, building, an MVP, and in many situations that's not that difficult to do. I think with a product like Trovata, it seems to me that it doesn't really work unless you have some banks on the other end of that integrated with your product. So did you build an MVP, and if so, how? Or did you just kind of go all in and say, we just need to build this thing and we need to get some integrations done before this thing is even something that people consider?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I think in this day and age too, you can't I think it's extra hard to build something in the enterprise because there's a certain rigor, resiliency, or robustness. There's a feature set. There's all these things that are just harder to do. It just takes longer, takes more capital, which all of a sudden becomes an access restriction because, seed investors might only want to, max you're going to get maybe is 3 to 5 million. It's rare to see like a really big seed round unless there's some connection maybe to the VC firm or things like that. But so you kind of have to stage your way into it. I would use the term license to hunt all the time in the early going. It's like, hey, it'd be nice if we had the luxury of just home running it. But one, that's not necessarily good either, because if you're building a field of dreams and then hope that everybody's going to show up and buy in that way, and it takes you 18 months and you're wrong, you're screwed, right? So, because you can't undo all that. So it's all about capital efficiency, proving your way, and then forcing yourself to kind of own and stick to that same rigor as well. Like you got to have these proof points and these milestones, and your investors need to see that too. So I think that's a big part of the MVP, why it's so good. But in the enterprise world, you've got to have a little bit more to that than the consumer space, where you almost like you build a very simple app can get you a long ways. In the enterprise, it's got to be more of a little more of a product, and so that becomes harder. But yeah, we did the early journey, and part of what did have a bit of a wrinkle was that if this is all going to be automation, we're going to build this whole new experience to manage cash, and it's going to be about automating workflows, like doing real work for accounting teams, finance teams, treasury teams. If you're going to do that, it's got to be data driven. And then if you're going to get it's data driven, well, where are you going to get the data? So, well, in this case, we're going to start with the banks. We're not going to the ERP system. And there's a big reason for that. My background is more in that, but I also learned that after post Amazon at this company, Worldwide Packets, and that's as a finance person to map more of the cash journey, which the treasury folks kind of live in that all day long, but more from a cash flow, from a CFO perspective, where cash as an operating tool. And so that was sort of the backdrop. So if it's going to be based on kind of, bank transactions, bank data, cash first, we're obviously going to need that data from the banks. How are we going to do that? Well, you have, at the time, screen scraping and the plaids, the aggregators on the small business side. And even them today aren't necessarily meant to aggregate transactions to power a solution like ours. So it's like, how are we going to get the data in the world of treasury that's 25 to 45 years old? It's all predicated on files that either come from the bank or come from SWIFT, which is a bank consortium, international consortium of that. And there are these very rigid standard formats to get a small amount of information, but it's precise and based on a defined, standardized format every single time. So you can build some repeatability on it, but it's limited, and it takes forever to connect initially. So the implementation side is just horrendous. There's companies that will have lots and lots of banks, and they'll spend 2-3 years and still haven't connected all their banks. It's like, wow, how does that? But that's that world. So for us, the thing for me was that I was kind of taking the bet that became a little bit of a blessing as well as a curse in some ways. Maybe that's too harsh of a term, but the aspect of we can turn it into a positive. We're gonna build this experience, and that's what we're prototyping. And I'm, as an entrepreneur, I'm gonna take the risk that the banks are gonna open up on the corporate side, and they're gonna roll out APIs. And everything that I was seeing is sort of the theater that was the fintech on the consumer small business side, where the banks were just hated screen scraping and they're kind of backdooring to get the data. And it's like, okay, the banks are going to have to do this because the demand is there. Customers need it. And so they kind of get a chance to do it over and do it securely and on their own terms. And so for me, it was like the banks have to build APIs. That was a big part of the core thesis. And if they don't, I'm screwed, right? So it was sort of building, and that was the full, 2.5 years early on of really building this, and then working with the banks. And then they did. That's when they released the first corporate banks in the world. JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America released APIs for balances initially, and then later transactions shortly after. And we were the first company to connect. And again, 2 years is still a long time before. And that was hard because it actually was a lot longer than I had hoped and expected. And it was kind of getting to where it's like, this is getting out there in terms of even risk for me, because I'm all in on it, and I'm starting to hit the wall a bit too. So I think part of that is once the banks open up, we were the first connect. And then the banks are like thinking it was going to be their customers that were connecting, and customers don't want to connect because these are really hard APIs. So we became a bridging aspect. The banks realizing, hey, we kind of need Trovata. They saw what we were building and what the data was going to be for. That kind of became, and early on, that was what I was hoping that would sort of turn into our flywheel, because we not only needed the data from the banks, but if the banks could just see what we're using their data for, and we're solving all these pain points from a user perspective through the platform for their customers, like we're doing a lot of what they should be doing, but they're not tech companies, then the banks will get behind it. And indeed they did. And that's where, once they saw, they're like, hey, we got to, and the other thing is that we brought their customers to them. We weren't asking for any handouts. We're showing up, and they were kind of used to that. They're like, okay, what do I got to do? You want me to connect you with some of our customers? Like, no. Square is a big customer of yours. And the treasurer, Tim, he's asking us on their behalf to connect to the API. And we're like, oh, really? And then we were bringing in real credible customers to the bank, which was honestly helping the bank validate their whole API thesis, which at that time was very being challenged within the big banks. So that helped them, it helped us, and then it became a bit of our flywheel, because once they could see that these companies, why were they doing this? Because they really want this experience. At that time, an MVP, but where this was going. And so that's when the banks are like, well, we have a lot of other customers that are going to want the same thing. And kind of back to your early question is like, again, cash is so prevalent with every company, regardless of, industry. And that's just where it became, the bank was seeing that. And then the bank started investing in Trovata. JP Morgan, after some of these cool world firsts that we were doing. And, then JP Morgan became our very first institutional investor that also was, kind of part of the early journey and early learnings as well.
That was a lucky break that just took a few years for you to.
Yeah, I had another mentor early on. He was really successful entrepreneur, had a company that built up, took public, and he's like entrepreneur of the year, and he's based in Toronto and Canada or something. He just had a real track record. And he said when he took his company public, one of the kind of junior investment bankers on the team, when they were kind of going through their roadshow, looked at him and says, "Man, you guys just came out of nowhere." And he's like, "Yeah, just a 12-year overnight success story." and I think it's so much of the aspect that you just kind of have to quietly build and take all these risks. And there's these moments, day to day, you're looking in the mirror, it's like, man, why am I doing this? But I got to do it. And you press on. It makes it all worth it when you have some of these breakthroughs.